and welcome to the Times Higher Education Impact Rankings Masterclass with a focus on Latin America. We'll just wait perhaps one more minute to allow some additional people to join, and then we will get on with the presentation. So once more, welcome to the Times Higher Education Impact Rankings Masterclass with a focus on Latin America. My name is Duncan Ross and I'm the Chief Data Officer for Times Higher Education. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Persephone, who will be supporting me with the Q&A session at the end. So today's presentation will take us through the methodology of the rankings, some of the rationale behind it, but also give us time to look at some of the data that has come out of universities from Latin America. And obviously in these days of Zoom, we have to do this pretty much with me talking for most of the time, but we would like you to participate and ask questions. And to do so, the best thing you can do is to type them into the Q&A or the chat boxes on Zoom as we go along. And then at the end, Persephone will read these questions out to me and I will do my very best to answer them. So please, any and all questions are welcome, because otherwise Persephone will have to make some up herself. So you join us in 2021 in what is an important year for Times Higher Education. This is our 50th anniversary. And throughout those 50 years, our goal has always been to help universities to understand their position against their mission, to help students find and access the universities best suited to their abilities and their aspirations, but above all to help higher education deliver transformational teaching, research and innovation. When we started out in 1971, we were a supplement to the Times newspaper in the UK. We've become independent many years ago, and of course what we do has expanded considerably, not least becoming far more internationally focused. But from my perspective, one of the most interesting changes has been about how we understand universities, not just through our journalism, although we continue to do that, but also through data. And obviously we look at data from different governments, from different countries, but there are relatively few comparable international data sets. And so one of the main ways that we are able to understand universities using data is through the collection of data in our rankings. Now we have three broad sets of rankings. The oldest is the World University Ranking, which was first created in 2004. And the World University Rankings focuses very much on research-intensive universities. So it looks at the research perspective on what we might describe as excellence of universities. Now in 2015 we were challenged by a former UK higher education minister to broaden the outlook and to look at teaching as well. Now, teaching is a much more difficult thing to evaluate on an international scale. So much of the outputs of teaching are relevant to specific contexts. Nevertheless, we've created two teaching rankings. The US College Ranking, which is published in the Wall Street Journal in the United States, and the Japan University Ranking, published in Japan. More recently still, we've started to address the impact mission. And in particular, we look at this through the perspective of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So how should we understand excellence in universities and in higher education? Well, I think we can make a case for all three of these different approaches. The research case is perhaps the most traditional one. Most of the so-called leading universities in the world tend to have a research focus, and if we were to go out onto the streets of Bogota or of Brasilia or of London or of New York and asked what are the best universities in the world, the answers we get back would probably be the same set of leading universities. We'd see Harvard, we'd see Cambridge, we'd see Oxford, maybe Sao Paulo as well, but research-focused universities. We also need to recognise, of course, that the route to leadership in universities is usually through that research route. So people become doctors, they become professors, experts in their own subjects, and from then they go on to lead faculties and eventually universities. What about the case for teaching, though? This is a case that our governments often focus on, sometimes seeing universities as little more than a route to take children from school and turn them into useful, functioning, employable adults. Often they focus on that far too much from my personal perspective. But we must recognise that teaching is a major source of university funding, whether it's from fees paid by students in countries where that's the situation, or whether it's direct resource from governments based on the number of students. There is no such thing as research. We can't have the next generation of researchers. But I'm now going to put the case that actually sustainability is just as important as teaching and research. It's important to universities as a way of evaluating their progress, but it's also important to the world that universities can play their full role in delivering sustainability. Now, why might I think that? Well, firstly, why is sustainability in its broader sense an important thing for universities to understand and to work towards? Back in 2015, the United Nations pulled together the Sustainable Development Goals, 17 goals that took into account not just traditional approaches to, but also looked crucially at equity and fairness across the world, and the need for countries and economies to develop in a sustainable way. They've been signed up to by 193 governments from across the world. And these 17 SDGs have associated with them 169 indicators and 223 specific targets. But universities have a crucial role to play in delivering those sustainable goals. About 1.7% of gross world product is spent on higher education. So higher education is a huge part of the global economy. And perhaps uniquely for all the industries in the world, when we look at higher education, it is where people are. We have universities in every country and in every part of every country. There are, by some estimations, up to 25,000 universities in the world. I can't imagine how we might expect to deliver on sustainability without universities playing their role. But that in turn leads into a very challenging question. How can we assess impact? Even if we use the Sustainable Development Goals, we run into a very real problem, which is that they were not designed with higher education in mind. And so to help us understand how universities might concretely deliver on sustainability, we've built out a theory of change. Now, a theory of change is simply a way of understanding how any organisation can go from inputs, the resources it has available, to outputs, the work it does, and eventually to outcomes, things that will change the world. And when it comes to universities and sustainability, our theory of change has four major elements. The first element is the research that your universities do. If you're doing research into battery technology, that will have a direct impact on the ability of the world to deliver on SDG number 7, clean and affordable energy, or SDG number 13, climate action. The second aspect is what I describe as stewardship. Universities are entrusted with significant resources. The physical land on which our campuses are built, but also the human resources of our faculty, our employees, and of course our students. How we look after those resources has a significant impact on sustainability. The third element is outreach. Universities have always worked with and in. This direct work is often underappreciated, especially when we come to assessments such as university rankings. But the work that universities do with their communities can clearly demonstrate and deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals. And then the final element is teaching. Both how universities deliver the graduates with the specific skills necessary for the SDGs, but also more generally, how universities can ensure that all of our alumni have the sustainable mindset that they will take with them, whatever role they have in life. And so for each SDG, we've put together a series of metrics that we hope talk to each of these four elements. For example, if we look at SDG 2, Zero Hunger, we look at measurements around research. What research does your university do into issues around hunger? In terms of stewardship, we look at student hunger. What efforts does your university make to ensure that no student has to give up their studies because of their hunger or their family's hunger? When we look at outreach, we look at the work you're doing in the community and also the work you do together with your governments to ensure that national issues of hunger are addressed. And in teaching, we look at the proportion of your graduates who leave university with a degree in agriculture or aquaculture, where sustainability is built into the curriculum. And for each SDG, we have built out a series of metrics. In essence, we've built 17 discrete rankings, one for each SDG. And below each of those SDGs, obviously we have a series of metrics and a series of measurements. And at the end of the process, we've spent time ensuring that the measurements we're asking universities to provide match back to the unique targets that the United Nations has set. Sometimes those are very direct links. So if we look at SDG 12, for example, the United Nations has asked for an increase in the number of organisations that produce sustainability reports. In our turn, we ask the universities, do you create a sustainability report? Less specific and is more about keeping with the objective, the overall objective and direction of the Sustainable Development Goal. But of course, this has resulted in a number of challenges because as we've built out the ranking, we've also had to decide how can we do this in a way that is fair and equitable to universities around the world. And the first major concern we had was around ease of participation. The previous slide showed that we have 220 measurements. That's a significant amount of data to ask any university to provide. And we were particularly concerned that universities who had fewer resources would find it difficult to supply data for every SDG. So as a result, we took a decision early on in the design phase that we would create an overall ranking where we would look at the university's submission for SDG 17, Partnership for the Goals, and that's an SDG that talks about the importance of all SDGs working together and all organisations working together to cooperate in addressing the problems of sustainability. So we take the score from SDG 17 and then any three other SDGs that the university might want to focus on. Now, we did this initially because we wanted to make participation as straightforward as possible. But we also hoped that it would allow universities to demonstrate if they had a specific focus around the work they were doing in sustainability. And we'll see later on whether that proved to be the case. But certainly my expectation was that universities in the world might have very different focuses. Why would a university in Sao Paulo have the same focus or a university in Southampton? And as I said, we will see later on whether that turns out to be the case or whether I had got it wrong and all universities are interested in the same sustainable development goals. Now, we also had to think very carefully about the metrics we chose. We had to choose metrics that had a clear link to the SDGs, but were worded in such a way that we could allow universities to answer in a way that made sense for them in their own contexts. We also had to consider whether or not we should focus on equity or equality between universities. And in the end, we've chosen some measures which are more based towards equity than equality. In other words, they are designed to reflect the need in societies where universities are located rather than necessarily a pure and easy level playing field. And finally, of course, we recognise that we will not have got everything right. I am for those of you who don't know me and haven't met me yet, I'm a 2 metre tall, white British Firstly, how do we evaluate research evidence? Well, the research data we use comes from our bibliometric suppliers, Elsevier. And what they've done is they've put together a keyword search for each sustainable development goal. They've done this through an iterative process involving experts along the way. And what this gives us is a set of documents for each SDG, and on top of those set of documents, we can apply measures for each university. And I'm going to show you in a few minutes. I'm going to jump into our benchmarking tool, SDG Impact Dashboard, and have a look at what this means in practical terms. But another difference between this ranking and most rankings is that we don't just deal with numerical data. We've also asked universities to provide evidence of the work that they are doing. So, for example, in SDG 6, Clean Water and Sanitation, we asked some questions about actions your university is taking regarding water in the community. One of the specific questions is about how your university cooperates with local, national, or global governments on the issue of water security. And here we're really looking for examples of what you're doing. And here we can see one such example. This is from a Chinese university, talking about how their Collaborative Innovation Centre for Clean Water works with the regional government on this issue of water security. One thing that's worth pointing out at this stage is, of course, as you can see, this is written in Mandarin. We don't expect the evidence that universities supply to be provided in English. We fully expect it to be provided in local languages because that makes sense. If you're doing work with your community, why would you write in English? You would write in Spanish or Portuguese. And so we ensure that our assessors have necessary language skills to enable them to interpret and read this evidence correctly. But because we're looking at subjective evidence, we've had to build out a process to ensure that we can evaluate this in a consistent and fair way. And to do this, we've created this very simple framework for scoring. Firstly, we look at whether the university says they do something. And if they say that they do something, we always give credit for that. Then we look at the evidence provided. If the evidence provided is a close match to the question, we will give a full mark. If it's a partial match, we give half a mark. And if it doesn't match the question at all, we won't give a score. The final thing we look for is whether or not that evidence is public. Now, we do this for three reasons. The first reason, which is by far and away the least important, is that public evidence gives us at Times Higher Education greater confidence that your university is really doing something. The other two reasons are the really important ones, though. The first of those is that by making this evidence public, you are holding yourself accountable to your community. That's a really important stance to take. And the second reason, which is just as important, is that by making your evidence public, you're giving other institutions the opportunity to learn and understand best practice. After all, sustainability is something that affects us all, and we want everyone to be as successful as possible. So let's have a look in slightly more detail at how we might do this. And I'm going to do this within the SDG Impact Dashboard, which is our benchmarking tool through which universities can compare their performance with that of other universities. Now, the first page I'm showing you here is one that is available for free for every university that participates in the ranking. And it shows that university's performance against each of the SDGs. So we can see here that this university has come in 4th place in the world. So with a little bit of research, you can work out which university it is. You can see how many SDGs it has chosen to participate in, 14 out of the 17. And then we have a box and whiskers chart which shows how well this university performs compared to the scores of every other university in the world. The black dot is this university's score. For those of you who aren't familiar with box and whisker plots, I'm going to give a very simplistic overview of how you can interpret them. Essentially, they're designed to show the distribution of a data set. So, for example, if we look here at SDG 9, Innovation, Industry and Infrastructure, the line in the middle of the plot represents the median value for all the scores in this particular SDG. In other words, if I line the universities up from the lowest scoring university to the highest scoring university, this is the score of the university exactly in the middle. The box represents the middle 50% of the distribution, and the whiskers represent the tails of the distribution, the highest scoring universities at the top, the lowest scoring at the bottom. So we can see that this university, it's come 4th in the world, is doing very well in most SDGs, although it's fair to say it does better in some than in others. We can also scroll down a little bit, though, and see more detail of performance. So here we can see, for example, in SDG 4, quality education, they're doing very strongly in terms of research and less strongly in terms of the proportion of graduates with teaching qualifications. Now, I'm now going to jump into the benchmarking part of the tool. Per publication. We can see the total number of views and downloads here, and we can also see the number of publications they have, which are associated with SDG 4. I'm now going to look at how we score one of the evidence-based questions. In this case, the question is about whether or not your university provides public resources to do with lifelong learning. In fact, we can see the more detailed question here. Does your university provide access to educational resources for those not studying at university? For example, computers, library access, online courses, and so on. And we can see here that La Trobe has said, yes, absolutely, we provide this. We provide this for free, which is excellent. We can see here a link to the evidence they provided, and I could click on that and open that in a new window. And we can see that our assessor has said, this is a great answer to the question. Below that, out of interest, we can see that 88% of all universities that have submitted to SDG 4 also provide free access to these materials. If I click on scores, we can see for La Trobe University, they score maximum points for free access, yet a point provided for specificity of the answer, and a point provided for the public nature of the answer, giving them the maximum possible score for this particular question. So that gives you an insight into how we do that evaluation. Now, we will be putting on a series of free workshops later in the summer where we will look at trying to explain to universities in more detail exactly the process that our assessors go through. And the reason we're doing this is to help you identify the best evidence you can to ensure that you can get as high a score as possible. We want to look for reasons to give your universities points, not to take them away. Now, how do we go from the individual SDG scores to the overall score? We take the score from SDG 17, and that's worth 22% of the overall ranking. And then we take the 3 SDGs in which your university scores most highly. Now, sometimes there the individual sustainable development goals. We've also spent a lot of time trying to ensure that we're providing clearer guidance on our methodology. This year, for the first time, we published the methodology in full in advance of data collection, and we will continue to do that. We've expanded admissions to allow postgraduate-only universities and higher education institutions to participate. But partly because of the growth in the ranking, we've had to have a stricter evaluation process this year. In terms of the number of pieces of evidence, we've now had over 100,000 pieces of evidence that our assessors have had to evaluate. So why do universities choose to participate? And I think it's important to think about this when we think about the relative performance of different universities. Well, the first reason that universities might want to participate, and this is a description from Santa Ono, the president of the University of British Columbia in Canada. The first reason is to get visibility for the excellent work that your universities, your institutions are doing around sustainability. There is absolutely nothing wrong with the idea of showcasing the work you're doing to inspire actions and hopefully to have greater positive impact in the world. But there are other reasons why you might want to participate. Dawn Freshwater, the Vice-Chancellor for the University of Auckland, which came top in our ranking for 2019 and 2020, sees the Sustainable Development Goals themselves as a spur towards cooperation between universities and between countries. After all, we know, and the COVID-19 crisis has demonstrated to us that no one country can stand alone when we think about sustainability. Things that happen in one part of the world will inevitably affect everyone across the world. And then one other reason which we think is really important is described here by Professor Duncan Everson of the University of Sydney. And that is to hold your university accountable to an external framework. And the Sustainable Development Goals give us that. They give us a framework against which we can hold ourselves accountable. And that's increasingly seen as something that's important for students, for staff, and for alumni. But with that, let's have a look at some of the results from around the world. And let's start by looking at how the number of universities in the ranking has grown from 2020. Now, this chart shows that by individual SDGs, but actually the number of universities has grown by 48%. We're now up to 1,240 universities participating overall, and with 1,117 universities in the overall ranking. This chart shows this SDG by SDG. The bar on the left-hand side for each SDG is the 2020 number. The bar on the right-hand side is the 2021 number. And what we can see, obviously, is that not all SDGs are equally popular. If we exclude SDG 17 for the time being, because that's the one that we've required to be compulsory, we can see that the most popular Sustainable Development Goals are SDG 4, Quality Education, and SDG 3, which is Good Health and Well-being. Those are both fairly understandable. Universities are focused on education, and many universities also are associated with medical education. Our doctors, our nurses go to our universities, and universities are often associated with university hospitals. But what's interesting is that some SDGs are much less popular. Now, of course, this might vary across the world. There's no reason to believe that all universities are following the same patterns. Now, participation has also grown significantly in every part of the world. The largest area in terms of submissions is without doubt Asia. I would really like to see more universities in South America and Latin America, and more universities from Africa participating in the future. But the numbers in every region have grown. The only region which is showing some signs of not growing much anymore is Australia and New Zealand, and that's simply because most of their universities are already participating. And sometimes we're asked, well, how many SDGs do universities choose to submit data for? We saw earlier La Trobe University looks at 14 of the 17 universities. But universities can choose to only provide data for 1 or 2 SDGs, and we see this on the left-hand side of the chart here. It's also not surprising that there's a peak here at 4 SDGs. That's the minimum number that universities have to provide in order to be in the overall ranking. And then that gradually tails off until we hit this spike at 17 SDGs. So why are so many universities, 262 universities in the last ranking, providing data for all 17 SDGs? Doing this increases their chance of getting obviously universities genuinely want to hold themselves of the commitment of universities to sustainability. SDG 4. SDG 4, Quality Education, remember, the single most popular SDG. It's clear that some countries in Latin America, if we look at Brazil, for example, is very strongly committed to supplying data for this SDG. But the same isn't true for all countries. For example, Chinese universities are less likely to provide data for this particular SDG, as are Sweden and Finland there in Europe. So we do see this varying by region and by country. In contrast, if we look at SDG 6, Clean Water and Sanitation, we see that this is a little bit less important to universities in Latin America than SDG 4 is. India, on the other hand, is much more interested in this. So our theory that different universities in different parts of the world would have very different focuses seems to be borne out in the data. But now let's look at the scores from universities in Latin America. So these box and whisker charts, same principle as before, but now we're looking at just the scores from universities in Latin America. Now, there are a couple of different ways you can interpret these. The easiest one is to look for the median values, so the line in the middle of those boxes, because that gives us a clue about whether typical universities in a region are performing better or worse than the world is on average. Broadly speaking, if they're above 50, that indicates that the region is outperforming the world. If they're below 50, the region is slightly underperforming the world. And if we do that, we can see there are some SDGs here, for example, SDG 1, no poverty, and SDG 3, good health and well-being, and even more so SDG 8, decent work and economic growth, where the median value for Latin America is clearly far in excess of the world median value. But we can also look at the whiskers here as well. And there, if we look at SDG 9, for example, or SDG 2, despite the fact that for SDG 9 the median value is below the world average, there are clearly some universities in Latin America who are able to perform exceptionally strongly in this particular sustainable development. And we do see some differences. When we look at the World University Rankings, we see it is very much focused on North America and Western Europe. But when we look at the Impact Ranking, we see that actually there are opportunities for universities outside those usual suspects to perform very well indeed. In fact, this year, 2 universities from Africa are in the top 100, and 3 universities from Latin America are in the top 100. This is even more the case when we look at individual sustainable development goals. But even when we look at the overall ranking, we can see that we're seeing some success, not by any means complete, but some success in our attempts to be equitable to universities from across the world. And in fact, when we look at the top universities, so these are universities from Latin America in the top 300, we can see that the top 3 universities from the region are, as I said before, Metropolitan Autonomous University from Mexico, the University of Sao Paulo from Brazil, and National Autonomous University of Mexico. But then we see universities in the 101 to 200 group, in the 201 to 300 group. One word about those groupings, by the way, we don't distinguish between the positions of universities within those groups. We put them in strict alphabetical order. Monterrey Institute of Technology is not higher than the Federal University Espiritu Santo. It's simply there because of alphabetical order. But let's look at a few individual sustainable development goals. And let's start by looking at SDG 2. So this is the one I used for my example earlier, where we talk about zero hunger. Now, the top university in the world was the Metropolitan Autonomous University from Mexico. And we can have a look at the scores that they got in the various different areas. You'll notice, by the way, that campus food waste wasn't in the example I showed before. That was because we couldn't use it last year. That's one of the changes we made to the data collection this year. But let's look at the scores from Metropolitan Autonomous University in Mexico. Their research is very strong, 80 out of 100 for research. They're doing a great job in terms of addressing campus food waste and in ensuring that their students don't go hungry. They also have a significant number of graduates who end up with degrees in agriculture or aquaculture, and they're reaching out to their community. So they're doing an excellent job there. But I think this is also a particularly strong SDG for other universities in Latin America. Universities from Brazil, from Ecuador, from Puerto Rico have all performed in the top 50. So that's an excellent sign that universities in the region are doing a really good job in this particular sustainable development goal. Now, if we move on to SDG number 8, remember this is another one that I highlighted as having particularly strong performance from universities in the region. The top universities in the region, we have 7 universities there in the top 100. And the top university from the region is the Federal University of Espírito Santo from Brazil. And it's interesting to see here that the kind of things we're looking to measure. Yes, we're looking to measure research, but we also want to look at how the university behaves as an employer. Are they a good employer? And we also want to look at their economic impact. Now, this is something that I think is worth spending a few seconds thinking about. Here we measure economic impact using expenditure per employee. But if we just looked at expenditure per employee, then what we would see is North American universities, particularly those from the USA, would dominate the ranking because if you're a university like Berkeley, you spend an awful lot of money. So in order to prevent that from happening, in order to understand how well the university acts as a hub for employment and for the benefits of its community, we balance this by the regional GDP for the community in which the university is based. And that allows us to distinguish between a university in San Francisco, in Oakland in the case of Berkeley, or a university here from Brazil, and allows us to get a much better feel for how important that university is to its community as an economic driver. And the final SDG I'm going to look at just in a little bit more detail is SDG 16, Peace, Justice and Strong Institutions. And here, I'm not going to look at the top university, which is the University of Guadalajara from Mexico. Although I should say, if anyone from the university is here on the call, I really enjoyed visiting Guadalajara a few years ago. Instead, though, I'm going to look at the top-ranked university from Chile, Diego Portales University. And again, we can look at the work that they're doing. Their research in this area is very strong. They have strong university governance measures, but there are still opportunities for improvement there. They're demonstrating that they are also working with government. Now, this is something that I think is increasingly important, how universities are able to work with their government to ensure that their expertise informs great policy decisions. And that's one of the things we're trying to capture in this particular SDG. But again, we can see that this is another area where there is good strength, excellent strength from universities in the region. Two final things, and then we'll open up for questions. So just as a reminder, you can add two final comments then, a little bit about our advisory board, and then some words about the process for next year's ranking. As I said before, we want to put together an advisory board to support us, to be a critical friend and help us develop this ranking in a way that is fair to universities across the world. We put out a request for people to put their names forward, and we had over 140 applicants, and unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your perspective, they were really, really good applicants. So it's taken us a lot longer to go through them than we had hoped. We haven't completed that process, and I do expect there to be at least one person from Latin America on the board when it's finished and when we've finished creating it. But I am pleased to be able to announce our first 4 members. They are Professor Max Liu, who is the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Surrey here in the UK. He started his academic career in Australia, and he's led universities in Hong Kong before moving on to the UK, so he brings a breadth of international leadership. But although it's great to have leaders on these committees, it's also great to have people who actually do the work. And Dr. Jingwen Mu, who is the Strategic Planning Manager for the University of Auckland, is the person who provides data from her institution. So it's really important to have that direct experience from people who've had to do the hard work. I'm also delighted that we're joined by Megan Faye-Zarnitzer, who's the Chief Executive Officer for the Association for the Advancement of Sustainability in Higher Education, based in the United States. They create the STARS accreditation system. And finally, we have Professor Yamaguchi, who is the Director for the United Nations University Institute for the Advanced Study of Sustainability, based in Japan. And as I said, we will add people to this committee, to this board, and we will have representation from Latin America. How can universities participate in next year's ranking? Most important thing to say is that we do not charge universities for entry in the rankings. Participation is free. Of course, there is a commitment of time and effort on your part, though. The methodology for 2022 will be published in September this year, and data collection will begin after that point in time. If you're interested in participating, please do email us on impact@timeshighereducation.com. That doesn't commit you to joining. That simply allows us to set you up so you can look at our data collection portal and explore whether this is right for you. But by doing that, there is no commitment. You can even enter data until you get to the end of the process and press the the submit button, then you aren't committed to being in the ranking. So please do feel free to about participation. And talking of questions, that brings me to the end of the presentation. So hopefully, Persephone, we have some really great questions that I can hopefully try and answer.
Thank you. One of the first questions that we have is from Carla. Is Sully test an adequate tool to provide evidence and education for the SDGs?
So for those of you who don't know, Sully test is an evaluation system which is designed to help not just universities, by the way, any organisation understand the extent to which members of that organisation, potentially students, for example, understand the concepts behind sustainability. And Sully test is one of the pieces of evidence we will take when we look at how you are looking at education for sustainable development. So in the SDGs, this is actually SDG 4.7, but because of the way we've designed the ranking, we've moved that to our SDG 17 because that's compulsory. And there, if you are participating in Sully test, then we would love to see that. We would see that as good evidence of your university's commitment to education around sustainability.
Thank you. A second question is, could you please let us know more about your methodology goals on the Impact Rankings contribution to the World University Rankings?
So at the moment, the Impact Rankings are a standalone ranking. Now, there are some reasons why that's the case. If we look at the World University Rankings with its focus on research-intensive universities, there is a strict threshold for participation. We require universities to produce at least 1,000 academic publications over a 5-year period. Now, when we look at sustainability, we actually think that every university, every higher education institution in the world should be able to be part of these rankings. And so we don't have that threshold. And as such, there's a little bit of a mismatch. We have approximately 700 universities in the impact rankings that don't participate in the World University Rankings, and we will expect that number to grow. So in the future, could there be an opportunity to include some elements of sustainability within the world rankings? I think yes. I think there is a really great question about how we could do that, though. And by the way, when I talk to the top research universities, they tend to say no, but that's, I think, their challenge rather than ours. So there are some possibilities there. We are exploring this at the moment in a smaller ranking we're doing in the Arabic region. So we're doing an Arabic universities ranking where we're experimenting with including an element of sustainability. It is something we'll keep an open mind on. And if our advisory boards recommend this, then that's something we would take very seriously indeed for the future.
Another question is, do you consider that the chances of a Latin American university of having students from low-income and low-middle-income countries is the same as a university from North America, Europe, or Oceania?
So, the question is?
if there are the same chances for a Latin American university to have students from low-income and low-middle-income countries as it is from universities from North America and Europe?
So clearly, it's a good question, by the way. So one of the questions we ask in SDG 1 is about, and this goes back to some of the key objectives of that Sustainable Development Goal, are whether or not universities provide access to students and financial support, by the way, to students from lower and lower middle income countries. And obviously, if you were, and I'm going to choose a university at random here, if you're Harvard University and you have an endowment of $37 billion, you could choose to do that for every single student in your university. Now, of course, Harvard don't choose to do that, and that's a different question. But if you're a university from Latin America, and perhaps your resources aren't as strong as Harvard's resources, can you afford to do that? Well, I think the straightforward answer is it is more difficult for you to do that. But what we have noticed is that where you might think universities with more resources would do this more, that doesn't turn out to be the case. Universities in parts of the world where they appreciate the value of education, where they appreciate what this can do to lift people out of poverty, are often far better at offering those places than universities from the global north, from the wealthier nations. So I do think that actually universities in Latin America can do this, and I think they do this. And sometimes, of course, that can be students from within the region as well. So it doesn't need to always be students from outside the region.
Another question is, in the present pandemic conditions, should the universities be specific on any SDGs?
So again, a great question, and it is one of the areas where we will look to adapt the methodology for this year. So obviously for many universities, this has been a very, very challenging year, often with campuses closed and a switch to distance learning and a significant curtailment of the activities you might normally undertake. As such, we want to be generous and ensure that we're looking not just for evidence over the last year, but evidence over several years to give every university a chance to demonstrate their performance as best they can. But I would expect to see, and we've already seen in this year's submissions, examples of work that universities are doing specifically around COVID. We know, for example, that universities have been at the forefront of work to address the pandemic, not just in terms of looking at vaccines, although that's clearly the front of many people's minds, but also in terms of some of the really practical work in the community and looking at ways of addressing the medical needs and the other social needs of our societies. So I would love to see examples of the work that universities are doing. But of course, even despite the fact we're still in the middle of an environmental crisis as well. And so it's still important that universities continue to focus on the other aspects of sustainability as best they can.
Thank you. One more question is, will the minimum number of the Sustainable Development Goals to be in the overall ranking be increased in the future?
This is a question for our advisory board, I think, which sounds like a horrible excuse. I think in the longer term it might well do. I think in the short term I want to keep it at this level to allow more universities to participate. I'm particularly thinking here about universities, by the way, from sub-Saharan Africa. Once we get to a stage where we've demonstrated that universities are able to participate in a straightforward fashion, that there aren't universities who are excluded because of the number of SDGs, then I think we can start to expand that number to get a much more rounded view of the work that universities are doing. I think there's also an interesting related question, which is that as the size of the ranking grows, does there come a point at which we may need to split it into components, either by regions or by the number of SDGs that universities choose to submit to? Because clearly, you know, we're at 1,200 universities at the moment. Imagine we were at 1,700 universities next year, maybe 2,500 the year after. There comes a point where this simply becomes too big and too unwieldy to be useful. So these are the kind of things that I would hope our advisory board would be willing to look at and think through.
Another question is about the valuation. How could we see the details of the evaluation?
So there is always But within the SDG Impact Dashboard, you can go through and you can see, as I tried to demonstrate with Latrobe, for each question, how they were evaluated. And if you had access to the dashboard, you could see how your university was evaluated at that level. So it is possible to see that. And hopefully that makes this as transparent a process as is possible.
And what's the submission deadline for the 2022 impact rankings?
We haven't determined the submission deadline yet. It's likely to be earlier than last year because one of the challenges we have faced is that as more universities participate, we're having to evaluate more evidence. And that takes longer, particularly in order to put in place the checks that we need to have to make sure that the quality of that assessment is consistent. As I said earlier, this year we had over 100,000 pieces of evidence to look at. I'm expecting that to be in the region of 150,000 or more next year. So we may need to bring that date forward from last year, but we will announce that as soon as we can. We want to give universities as much time as we reasonably can, while still having enough time to do the evaluation fairly and securely.
And the number of publications in data points is different from that in Scopus. Can you explain the normalization process applied in the rankings?
So the number of publications associated with the SDGs should be consistent within
Session.
The answer to that is yes, it should be. As soon as I can get it to Persephone and change the one spelling mistake that I noticed on the way through, then it will be made available.
Perfect. Thank you. These were all the questions that we received.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Persephone, for reading those out. Thank you to everyone who submitted a question and for all of you who have been part of this broadcast. Thank you for paying attention to the impact rankings. We're very excited. We think they're a really important way of assessing universities. But finally, can I say on behalf of Times Higher Education, can I wish you, your families, your communities and your universities all of the best in this very challenging and trying time. Please keep safe and keep healthy, and I hope we'll have the opportunity to meet in person in the future. Thank you very much.